The day of the funeral was heavy with clouds and tension. The estate, grand and echoing with silence, stood like a fortress that had seen too much sorrow and secrecy. The death of the matriarch had left behind a void, but also a storm. Her 3 sons, each carrying the burden of their own flaws, barely made an effort to hide their indifference. Some came late, some not at all. The whispers among the servants painted them as ungrateful heirs who didn't deserve even their mother's last farewell. Their father, Victor Alden, a man feared more than loved, seethed with disappointment. He called them heartless brats and vowed not to leave them a cent, shocking everyone by declaring that the estate would go to someone else entirely. The someone else was Lori, a waitress who had been working quietly in the mansion as a maid. She had no family, no home in this country, and nothing to call her own. She had spilled wine on Richard, the eldest son, earlier that same day and was nearly fired on the spot, but Victor's intervention changed everything. He saw in her a way to punish his sons, to bend them into shape by forcing them to win her heart. The estate would belong to her, he announced, unless one of his sons could make her fall in love. It was a game, a cruel test, and Lori was caught at the center of it. At first, she thought it was a mistake. She begged to be spared, telling Victor she didn't want any of his wealth, only her simple job. But he insisted. She would have her own room, her own clothes, her own place in the house. It was a dream that felt more like a curse. Richard, cold and arrogant, approached her first. He cornered her in the hallway, his voice sharp as glass. He spoke of marriage, of signing papers, of giving her security. He said it as if it were a transaction, a deal she couldn't refuse. But Lori saw through him. She told him she wouldn't be his pawn. His pride was wounded, but his desperation was clear. Larry, the second brother, was reckless and wild. He brought the party into his private bar, flashing his wealth and indulgence. He tried to impress her with music, liquor, and charm, but beneath the bravado she saw something hollow. When she told him he was gray, a man who had forgotten how to be alive, his face cracked with something real. For the first time, someone had pierced through his haze. He admitted she had stirred something in him, but he was too broken to offer her more than regret. Then there was Ethan, the youngest, bound to a wheelchair, quiet and observant. He didn't chase her with gifts or seduction. Instead, he warned her. He told her about his father's games, about how she was being used as bait in a cruel competition. He revealed the darkest truth. Their mother's death had not been natural. She had fallen on the grand staircase, and Ethan had always suspected their father's hand in it. The guilt of not saving her haunted him. His warning to Lori was clear. Leave while you still can. But Lori could not leave. She had no family to run to, no safe place beyond the walls of the estate. And Victor knew this. That was why he chose her. She was trapped. The tension thickened as days passed. Victor watched from the shadows, his cane tapping against the marble floors as if to remind them of his presence. Richard grew angrier, Larry more erratic, Ethan more desperate. Each of them, in their own way, tried to win Lori, but none succeeded in touching her heart fully. She saw fragments of humanity in them, yes, but also the reflection of their father's cruelty. The night the storm rolled in, everything came to a head. Victor gathered them all in the great hall, his voice thunderous. He declared that Lori must choose, here and now, or be thrown out with nothing. Ethan wheeled himself forward and for the first time raised his voice. He said he would not let his father control them anymore. He accused Victor of killing their mother, the words echoing like a slap in the silent hall. Richard turned pale, Larry froze, and Victor only laughed, cold and merciless. He admitted the truth without shame, saying their mother had been weak and Ethan had been too slow to save her. The rage that filled Lori in that moment burned brighter than fear. She stood tall, trembling but firm, and told Victor she would never marry for his money, never sign his papers, never play his game. She would rather walk away with nothing than live as a prisoner in his house. Richard tried to argue. Larry wavered, but Ethan wheeled forward, placing himself between her and his father. He told her she wouldn't face the world alone because he would stand with her. Larry, shaken, agreed for once. And Richard, though reluctant, did not stop them. Victor sneered at all of them, calling them pathetic, saying they were nothing without him. But for the first time, they stood together, not as his pawns, but as a family against him. That was when everything changed. The silence after Victor's cruel confession was unbearable. The only sound was the rain slamming against the tall windows of the great hall, as if the heavens themselves wanted to wash the house clean of its sins. Laurie's chest tightened. She wanted to run, but her feet were frozen, as if roots had grown deep into the marble floor. Ethan, steady though his hands trembled, fixed his eyes on his father with the calm fury of a man who had carried too many burdens for too long. "You don't own me anymore," Ethan said, voice low but unshakable. Victor leaned heavily on his cane, his lips curling into a smile that never reached his eyes. "You think standing up to me makes you free? You're still mine. All of you. Even her." His hand gestured toward Laurie like she was nothing more than a pawn on a chessboard. Richard's face was pale, his arrogance cracked open like glass under a hammer. He had always thought himself his father's mirror, but now he saw only a monster in front of him. "You killed her," he whispered, almost to himself. "You killed our mother, and I did nothing." His fists clenched, and for once the pride in his eyes faltered into shame. Larry, who had always hidden behind noise and laughter, stood unnaturally still. The Playboy mask slipped, and beneath it was a lost boy who had been running from shadows his entire life. He looked at Ethan, then at Laurie, and for the first time spoke without mockery. "Maybe it's time we stop letting him play with us. Maybe it's time we choose who we want to be." Victor laughed again, louder this time, his voice echoing up into the rafters. "You think you can survive without me? You wouldn't last a day. You're weak, all of you, worthless. That girl won't save you. She'll ruin you." But Laurie found her voice then, rising above the storm outside. "No," she said. "I won't ruin them. You already did. You ruined everything, and I won't be a part of it anymore." The weight of her words shifted something in the room. Richard turned toward her, his mouth opening to speak, but no words came. Larry lowered his gaze, struggling with emotions he had never dared face. Ethan, however, straightened in his chair, his hand reaching for hers. She hesitated for only a second before placing her trembling fingers in his. Victor's eyes narrowed, and the cane struck the marble with a sharp crack. "Ungrateful, every last one of you," he hissed. "Fine, take your stand, but don't come crawling back when the world spits you out. Without me, you are nothing." And with that, he turned his back and left the hall, his shadow long and crooked under the golden lights. The sound of his cane faded slowly, leaving behind only the storm and the heavy breaths of those who remained. Laurie felt her knees weaken, but Ethan's grip on her hand steadied her. Richard rubbed a hand over his face, as if trying to erase years of being his father's echo. Larry laughed bitterly, shaking his head. "That's it, then. He's cut us off." "Let him," Ethan said quietly. "We don't need him." But the reality of those words was harsher than they sounded. The next morning, true to his promise, Victor's lawyers arrived. All bank accounts belonging to the brothers were frozen. Credit cards, properties, everything tied to his name, gone in an instant. The Alden Empire was theirs in name only. In truth, it had always been Victor's leash around their necks. For the first time in their lives, the brothers were stripped bare. No money, no power, no easy escape. And Laurie, the girl who had been thrown into their world like a lamb among wolves, found herself standing among men who had never learned to live without wealth. The days that followed were strange. Richard, who had never brewed his own coffee, fumbled with a machine in the kitchen, burning his hand in the process. Larry, whose life had been an endless stream of champagne and neon lights, found himself restless, pacing the halls like a caged animal with no audience. Ethan, quiet as always, adjusted with a resilience born from years of surviving loneliness. And Lori became their anchor. She taught Richard how to boil pasta, laughing softly when he scowled at the stove like it was his enemy. She coaxed Larry into helping clean, handing him a mop he pretended to hate but secretly didn't mind. With Ethan, she shared long talks in the evenings, sometimes about books, sometimes about dreams, sometimes about nothing at all. Slowly, painfully, the brothers began to change. Richard discovered a strange satisfaction in small victories, like fixing a broken hinge without calling a servant. Larry learned the silence of sober nights, sitting by the fire instead of drowning in music. Ethan's shoulders lightened, if only slightly, knowing someone was willing to listen without judgment. But Victor was not gone. From the shadows, he watched, waiting for them to fail. He sent whispers through the estate, tempting offers, reminders of what they had lost. Richard was the first to be tested, approached by an old business partner offering him a way back into wealth if he abandoned his brothers and Lori. Richard struggled, the old hunger for power gnawing at him. But one night, Lori found him staring at the contract, his hands shaking. She didn't scold him, didn't plead. She only asked, "Would it make you proud of who you are?" The question broke him. He tore the contract in half, and for the first time in years, he felt lighter. Larry's test came later, an invitation to a grand party, glittering with temptation. The old him would have gone without a thought. But when he stood in the doorway, tuxedo half on, he caught Lori's eyes. There was no judgment there, only quiet disappointment. He pulled the jacket off and stayed home, pouring the expensive liquor down the sink. Ethan, however, was tested in a darker way. Victor came to him directly, one evening when the others were gone. He leaned close, whispering poison. "She doesn't love you. She pities you. She'll never choose a broken man in a chair. Don't fool yourself." Ethan didn't respond at first. He let the words sink into the cracks of his insecurities, the same ones that had haunted him since his mother's death. But when Lori found him later, staring at his useless legs with tears in his eyes, she knelt beside him. "You are not broken," she said. "Not to me. Not ever." And in that moment, something inside him healed. The turning point came weeks later, when Victor summoned them all once more. His health had begun to falter, though his pride would never admit it. He stood in the great hall, leaning heavier on his cane, his voice still sharp but thinner than before. "I gave you a chance," he sneered, "and you wasted it. Look at you, living like peasants, clinging to scraps of dignity. You'll beg for my forgiveness before the end." But this time, none of them bowed their heads. Richard stood straighter, Larry steadied himself, and Ethan wheeled forward with Lori by his side. "You're wrong," Ethan said. "We don't need your forgiveness, and we don't need your money. For the first time, we're free, and that's something you'll never understand." Victor's face darkened, his fury shaking his frail body. "You'll regret this," he spat. "You'll all regret it." But the storm that once hung over the estate had already begun to lift. For the first time, the brothers weren't fighting each other, but standing together. For the first time, Lori wasn't a pawn in someone else's game, but the heart that bound them. In the weeks that followed, they began to build something new. Richard started working with his own hands, opening a small but promising business. Larry found purpose in music again, not the shallow kind that filled clubs, but the kind that stirred souls. Ethan, with Lori beside him, began to heal in ways doctors had never managed. And Lori herself, once a lonely waitress with nothing, discovered that sometimes love wasn't about wealth or power. It was about the courage to choose family where there had once been none. Victor lived on, bitter and alone, watching as the empire he had built slipped away, not because it was taken, but because his sons no longer wanted it. His punishment was not losing his wealth, but losing the control he had prized above all else. And so the estate, once a place of cruelty and shadows, slowly became a home. Not perfect, not without scars, but real. For Lori, the girl who had stepped into the mansion with nothing but a waitress' apron and hope in her eyes, it was the beginning of a life she never imagined. A life not defined by money or manipulation, but by love, resilience, and the choice to stand tall, even in the face of a storm.